I think you'll be able to find the link on our website. Usually we begin, or at least the end this introduction, with a quote from the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, on how it's necessary to change the world. I'd like to add another quote from Marx also, and which is relevant to what we're doing today. The weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace the criticism of weapons. Physical force must be overthrown by physical force. But theory, too, becomes a physical force as soon as it seizes the masses. I want to say that given the disarray of what passes for the revolutionary and Marxist left in so many countries, making Marxist theory into a material force is an urgent matter. And that's really that is the only focus of ICSS. And I hope you will join us in this important work. And I'll try and explain at the break some of the ways you can do that. Our speaker today, Raj Sahai, is an exemplar of this attitude, of this effort. Raj has been a revolutionary activist, Marxist scholar and teacher in both his native India and here in the US for many decades. I was going to say count the number of decades, but I'm sure nobody will believe it's that many. But given his youthful appearance, but it's a long time. And one of the important contributions he's made to the work of ICSS has been to make it a truly international operation. So we appreciate that. Raj's topic today will be capitalism, ecology, and socialism. He will speak for about close to an hour, and then we'll have a break for announcements and other business, and then another hour or more for question and answers and comments, which will be moderated by me. And then at the end, if there's time, we will have sort of an open discussion with everybody who's left. So with that, I'd like to turn the virtual floor over to Raj. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So I have put the 7 points on which I'll be speaking. Those are the headings of the areas that I'll cover under the general topic cover in the chat room. So if you want to look at it, I'm not going to put them up on the screen. So I argued in my previous talk that capitalism cannot solve the problem it created: degradation of Earth's ecology and impoverishment of the workers of the world, which are at least 90% of the population of the world, if not 95%. There is another class above workers, which is the small capitalists, petit bourgeois, as we call it. And then there are capitalists, which are much less than 1%, probably less than 0.1%. So at best, we can put pressures on our capitalist governments wherever we are to slow it down. And for that, we all should do what we can collectively. But in my opinion, that is not going to be sufficient. So in this talk, I raise the question this way: can the alienated individualism and consumerist way of life that is threatening the ecological balance in nature created by neoliberal capitalism be ended by a new socialist revolution? Can a new socialism build a healthy, materially adequate society for all human beings so we can live in balance with nature? So that's the question I'm going to address. And actually, alone, I cannot answer it. So this is going to be a work in progress with a lot of people in the world, but certainly in this group. So I want to begin where Marx began his writing in Das Kapital, or The Capital. That's a book of 3 volumes, collectively about 2,500 pages or 2,400 pages. He did that by analyzing commodity production. Now, Marx had a PhD in philosophy, but he starts out with an object called commodity. Commodities, of course, existed before capitalism, but they were exchanged with money in order to buy other useful commodities. Expressed in Marx's formula, commodity, money, commodity, or CMC in symbols. And while it may be that one person got the better of the bargain than the other, in that exchange, it was not itself a system of exploitation systematically of one person by another, until traders began to take those commodities far away from where it was produced locally and used locally to start making profit, because other people who didn't see this shiny object or useful object that they didn't make, they paid more. So this is the first raising of wealth that became a form of capital before industrial capital. So, but that's the wealth accumulated. It was a huge wealth. The 3 companies that were specifically raised for that were East India companies. They're all called East India companies in different languages. The first actually was Holland, and the second was England, and third was France. And but it was not until the French Revolution that actually ushered in the era of capitalism, which was 1791, and then it gave a tremendous spurt to scientific knowledge, secular scientific knowledge, created the basis, which then capitalism utilized to develop industrial capitalism. Okay, and this industrial capitalism is roughly 220 years old. It begins with James Watt, who invents this steam engine, and that gets used for for spinning threads from cotton. Okay, so under this form of industrial capitalist production, everything changed. Marx studied it. Marx lived 1818 to 1883, about 65 years of his life. He was born in Germany, and he got his PhD in Germany. And then as soon as he started criticizing the injustice towards poor people, he got thrown out of Germany. And then he went to France, and he was in Paris, and he got thrown out of there because he was a muckraker there too. So he ended up in England, in London, which is where he essentially spent the rest of his life. And England was very secure at that time, so it was liberal, because by 1840s, 50s, whenever Marx came here, there to the times that it was very secure. It was the biggest, powerful country in the world, and had kind of a beginning to have liberalism as its way of life. So under this form, industrial capitalist production, Marx expresses this system change as money, commodity, more money. MCM prime, where M prime, the last M, is larger by M by more money, that is amount of M, that is the profit realized from this exchange. So the purpose of commodity production changed from exchange of useful commodities via money as a medium exchange in small villages and towns to commodities simply as a means to enlarge money, nothing else. So commodity produced since that time is the whole and sole purpose of that is to make money. Okay, when I was growing up in India, I first heard the term making money in Reader's Digest somewhere, and I said, what do they mean by making money? I was pretty young at that time. I thought you earn money, but in America, they call it make money. Okay, anyway, that's an expression of MCM prime. In the neoliberal capitalist era, which in my opinion, is roughly 30 years old, substantially. It may started earlier, but substantially is 30 years old and coincides with China adding to the commodity production on a massive scale in the past 30 years. The ecological problem, bad already, because there were already all these capitalist countries producing commodities selling all over the world. Europe and the United States has gotten much worse now because there's an additional amount, right? Now people face ecological crises in different forms in different places. So it brings me to my third point here, third category. What is private property and rise of imperialism? Now, private property, we take it for granted, is something very original and something very natural. But Earth didn't bestow this to anybody, okay? Earth was there before human beings, and it'll be there after we leave as a species, and they will leave sometimes. So Earth didn't belong to anybody, okay? And man's labor also wasn't a private property, okay? Before capitalism, of course, there was serfdom, and before that it was slavery. So under serfdom, a person was essentially a semi-slave to the master. But since the capitalist revolution, it based this thing, it freed the person from his property, pushed him out from owning any property, and the man's labor power then is the only thing he owns privately, okay? You're born with only one thing, that, unless you're born into a rich family, then you have something else, or, well-to-do family. So that's few people, but over 90% are born where essentially their parents are working for somebody as workers. It may be mental worker or physical worker, but they're all workers. So a man's labor power on one side, private ownership of capital by a capitalist on the other, on which capitalism bases itself, becomes a fetter later on capitalist system over time, according to Marx. Since, according to Marx, production socializes under capitalism. So whatever is produced as a commodity has a social basis. So there is a contradiction. There is a private domain of labor for worker, capital for the capitalist, and then there's a socialization process goes on. So this contradiction reaches its highest peak in the highest stage of capitalism, which Lenin analyzed. Of course, now Marx dies in 1983. Lenin is the next most important person who studies on capital in the new age, which is age of imperialism, Lenin calls. So he termed this new stage of capitalism as imperialism. Now, so here I mean imperialism by that. The economic essence of capital at its highest stage, the rotten stage, okay? It's a rotten stage, the crisis stage of capital. But the crisis of capitalism also then becomes the crisis for workers. and small independent producers, peasants and small businesses all over the world. And when this happens, capitalists turn towards fascism. And workers in response must turn towards social revolution to overthrow capitalism. So that's the foundation of what capitalism, analysis of capitalism leads to Lenin to theorize. And on the basis of that theory and other work that Lenin did, this happened in Soviet Union. So I claim this is where we stand today. Monopoly capital, and that includes capital accumulated in China, needs higher profit rate. And it is hampered attaining it despite the neoliberal model it foisted upon the world, precisely to overcome its overproduction problem. This is what happens. Capitalist production goes on because commodity is just a transient point to make money, right? So the production keeps on happening because capital keeps accumulating over time. More and more money gets accumulated. It reaches a point of overproduction, creating these commodities, assuming they will be sold. Or it accumulates in the banks, or it is in the workshop or the factory. So these are the three forms of capital, right? Capital is in three forms: money in production, then when it is raw materials and people working on it, and then in commodities. Okay. So it has, so neoliberal capitalism, in this mania for getting out of its previous trouble, which was the trouble of the Western world, capitalists accumulated too much, they were looking to invest somewhere. And they did it in China. It happened. And then all of a sudden, capitalist development in China takes place. And the commodities, both by American capital and Chinese capital now, are adding to the problem. And once again, we're back to this stage of imperialism now, that economics in a sense. So many comrades, many communists and Marxists have a different concept of imperialism. They think imperialism is is military power to suppress other countries to their own will. Of course, that happens. But the economic essence is the essence of imperialism, not this other thing. Other things are the means for that. So that has to be understood, because without that, a lot of Marxists will just simply say, well, imperialism exists in the United States, or United States is the imperialist, China is not, or Russia is not, or no other country is possible because imperialist is one country. Or people associated with America, like Japan and Europe, maybe. So that's a mistake, in my opinion. So, so now with this consumerist last phase neoliberal capitalism is now eating into the very material basis of human existence, the planetary ecology. So now the problem is that the very basis of our existence is threatened. Of course, not all of us will die. It means degradation, but millions could die, tens of millions, hundreds of millions could die in this, if it is not changed, and human beings change. And that's why revolutions occurred, because humanity cannot die so easily. So I basically say problem of ecology, degradation of ecology, cannot be overcome under capitalism. And capitalism has to be replaced, and replaced by communism. Okay, communism is where this whole madness ends, manic depressive disease of the world called capitalism ends. Now, communism, you can't get there like in one stage, and we can go into what is communism, but the transitional stage is socialism. Communism is where society is so well developed in terms of people becoming civilized, so to speak, civilized in the real sense. So their consciousness has been risen so that they don't feel alienated from, they don't need to hoard, steal, do hustling and other means to get something for themselves at the cost of others. So that's the society in which people work for society and take what they need, but they don't overeat, they don't overconsume, they don't do things. So they become cautious human beings. Now, in between these two stages, there is a transitional stage, lower form. So that is socialism. That name socialism is given to that transitional stage. And following Lenin and Stalin, I also believe that this stage cannot be skipped. It is not a choice before us, communism or socialism. Under communism, commodity production is done away with completely. And so there's no question about disharmony with nature because you only produce what you need. And in my guess is that we're producing probably 5 times as much of useful things, the genuinely useful thing than we need collectively, the whole world. So while a lot of people's needs are not met, which are basic needs are housing, food, housing, healthcare, education. These are 4 basic things, right? And then cultural development as a result of that. So we can't get there in one step to that kind of society. We have come a long ways, though, in terms of culture. We have developed culture today where things that were up to 1950 and even until 65, the blacks were not considered full human beings. They didn't have a right to vote. Women were in bad ways. So all that revolution continues to happen. But in order to achieve its results, capitalism has to be transcended. Okay, and so far this has been possible by a revolution. Okay, so anyway, let's proceed then. But the question then is, does commodity production continue to exist under socialism? Because commodity is the way capitalism actually robs the worker. It doesn't pay the worker for all his work, or her work. It pays less than what work is completed. That's what forms the profit. That's the Marxist thesis. And people have tried to say, no, it doesn't happen that way. It is because you buy cheap, sell dear, or market, you're smart enough in the market to make money, you make money. Okay, well, that's not true. I mean, COVID-19 showed who are the essential workers, right? There's a category called essential workers. If wealth could be produced simply by buying and selling, then why do we need these people? So it's clearly it's a fraud to that bourgeois economists have perpetrated on behalf of the capitalist class. So even a musician or an actor, both of them are in my family, they just don't create their art for and be content with it. It's social, right? Because they exist because there is a community who values it. And under capitalism, it all gets degraded. You're buying and selling, even art, okay? So let's talk about what happens to commodity production under socialism, the transitional stage. Okay, so there is something, Marx came up with a law of value. This is for those I'm explaining, those who haven't read Marx's Capital. The law of value is basically, according to Marx, when a worker creates a commodity, his labor gets congealed as an abstract labor. Now, if you contrast it, suppose I make if I was able to knit a sweater for you, my friends here who are here, I will give you as a gift, or you will give me something in return, but you will see my concrete labor there. And you know who it is, who did it. There's a bond between us. But it all gets ended when the labor gets into the commodity as abstract labor. Okay, it's marked or a dead labor. So it's congealed in the commodity, all the work, only part of which is paid to the worker. And through that exploitation is the scientific term of unpaid wage, unpaid labor of the worker that's in the commodity. That's exploitation. So the question is, when capitalism has been overcome, which will take a long, intense, big, and bloody fight, as it has in the 20th century, will the law of value continue to operate in socialism? And if it does, how would it be different for worker? And what is its impact on the ecology of the planet? Okay. Now, the first big country, and actually the first country to successfully, any country, to successfully have a socialist revolution is Russia. And that happened in 1917, led by Lenin. And Stalin became the head of the Communist Party that guided the building of socialism in Russia. Of course, the first socialist revolution was not Russia, it was in Paris, in the city of Paris, 1871. But it lasted 6 weeks. This one lasted 7 decades, so much more substantial. Like all first models, they have problems, right? Anyway, Stalin was the head of Communist Party that practically built the first successful socialist state, the USSR. So let us see what he said about it. Stalin said that the law of value continues to operate as long as there are commodities. Now, this has been criticized by many Marxists. According to Stalin, the law of value did not apply to the means of production, okay? That is the machinery that is used in the production of consumer goods. So when you make a tractor, that's a means of production. That's a simple example of it. Tractors, harvesters, or lathes, etc. These are all what Marx calls Department 1, or means of production. Okay, so they completely socialized it. The worker state owned it. Okay, workers worked there, but not for wages. Okay, they were given enough to live on because they're building a new society. Okay, and they worked there too. And then those tractors were given to farms, but these are not private farms, they were collective farms. The collective farms was an intermediate stage. You know, they are semi-socialist. Now, here's the thing, where peasants always have had, like all small business people, have this private property instinct. So the land for the peasant is, you know, he knows this is his means of production, doesn't want to let go of it, and it's rooted in him culturally for a long time. And in fact, that's what happened. So the socialist revolution actually took away the land from landlords and the churches and the feudal nobility, spread it to those landless peasantry. That's the first thing Lenin did. That's kind of bourgeois solution, right? So, but Lenin it was a transitional stage. So that's how peasants supported the revolution. So they became allies. Lenin called them strategic allies. And that's another one of Lenin's contribution to theory of revolution, alliance with peasantry, which is the only successful model of revolution in this world, actually. It got repeated in China and elsewhere. So according to Stalin, law of value did not apply to the means of production because they were provided to these farms, collective farms. And by the way, more than 80% of the farms were collective farms. There were 15% of the land was in government-owned farms, which means they worked like the factories, so like a worker-owned factory. Okay, production. So they were workers who were not collective owners of it because the state was theirs and they were working. But over 80% of the collective farms, and there were two kinds there, and there are all kinds of details there. But even there was some private farming. 1 or 2% of the land was still privately plowed, and those were very marginal farmers that were left there because they were in very backward areas of the country. And Russian empire was very large, and nationalities that were not Russian very much oppressed. So to bring them out, you could only do it slowly. So anyway, this is the reason why there were collective farms. So collective farms, in exchange for all machinery provided, seeds often provided from the factory farms to them, good seeds, and then also advice on modern farming methods, training on tractors, all this done by worker state, okay? In return, they took some grain from them for the workers, for food. So this was what they did, but the collective farms were allowed to sell part of their product, grains, etc., vegetables and all that, in the market. And so therefore, according to Stalin, commodity remained, okay? Just because you've gone to socialism, you can't eliminate commodity by one single soup, it cannot. Also, when you're trading, let's say with capitalist countries, which you have to trade because you can't make everything, then you trade something, then even the production machinery, which is used for what we call Department 1, means of production were exchanged as commodity. So the commodity exchange was very constrained, okay? This is an important point because a lot of people think it is either that under Stalin, everything was run by the state from a heavy hand and things like that. But that is not quite true, okay? Of course, part of it is true, but we can get into that. But economically, this was the way things were run. But whatever they sold collective farms in the open market as trading and by trading, improved their lives, but did not raise capital. Did not raise capital for them to become capitalists. Anyway, what happened was things changed after Stalin's death. Okay, so commodities were traded, but okay, the basis also of commodity in socialist economy was for measuring value. So there was no exploitation; they were traded on value. Means you have to determine how much labor time, otherwise one person will be taking advantage of the other, right? So this is what they did. Things changed after Stalin's death in 1953 and Khrushchev's assuming power. So here there's an Indian Marxist writer, Vijay Singh, wrote an essay published in 2007 called Making of the Political Economy of Socialism. I'm quoting here, centralized directive planning essentially ended in 1955 and was replaced by coordinative planning conducted by Gosplan, that's the Central Economic Planning Agency, and the All Union and Union Republic Ministries. There's the All Union and the Union Republic Ministries, the republic, they're all called republics, different republics. In 1957, the system of planned allocation of products produced by the means of production was terminated, and a number of centralized sales organizations were set up to sell the industrial products of Soviet industry, means of production, were now transferred from one government enterprise to another through purchase and sale as commodities. So that provided the basis of squeezing out money. And so in 1950, the Soviet government dissolved the machine tractor stations that they used to provide to collective farms and permitted the sale of agricultural machinery to the collective farms. Because of these means of production both in industry and agriculture, now began to circulate commodity. This is the reversal. This is the basis of reversal of Soviet Union towards capitalism. Not as somebody says, well, it was Stalin's atrocities and things like that. No, that is not the reason. We can discuss that in another forum. In fact, Grover Furr will be speaking here. You can raise this to your heart's content, that issue with him. He's a researcher on Soviet history. So the reversal undermined the socialist economy and led towards capitalism. As now Kieran and Kenny, two American authors, have argued in their excellent book, Socialism Betrayed. And he shows that the black economy developed because they couldn't bring this money into, after all, it was socialism officially, and you couldn't openly start a capitalist enterprise. So it was all done in a black economy. And that in turn corrupted the party. Party members began to be essentially become part of that. And this happened in the Russian wars, and in that is why the Communist Party itself dissolved their own party and turned towards capitalism in 1991. It was not that somebody beat them into it. Of course, the external pressures were there, no question about it. That intensifies, under pressure, you have to do everything right, okay? You make a mistake, you pay a bigger price. So the Russian workers have again become wage slaves, and that is what Russia is today. You can describe it more accurately as state capitalism. There are multiple electoral parties, that's true, but it's dominated by one party, Putin. Consumerism today also dominates Russian life, as it does the rest of the world, or most of the rest of the world. Maybe it doesn't do it in Cuba, North Korea, maybe 2-3 states, but that's it. So anyway, so that brings me to discuss China, Maoism and the Great Reversal in China. I know many people here would not agree with me about Great Reversal, but we can discuss it. In Mao's evaluation, Stalin model of political economy suffered from too much centralization. So this was Mao's evaluation that, and in any case, China in 1949 was different in two respects from Russia of 1917 and even of India of 1949. Its industrial base was smaller, largely limited Eastern Seaboard. So industrial productivity was even smaller than that of Russia in 1917, India of 1947, when India gained political independence from Britain. Mao, in the economic development strategy, did what was his revolutionary strategy of seizing power, surrounding capitalist stronghold of cities from the countryside. Communist Party led by Mao organized village communes as the basic production units for both agricultural and industrial production. Now, this started during the war effort when he was fighting against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists as well as Japanese imperialists. The Americans were helping, the United States was helping Chiang Kai-shek, big time. Transport was poorly developed in China up to 1949, when the communists assumed power. Much of the country was isolated from urban life, was backward, and peasants lacked industrial products. In any case, roads were not there, trains, very limited rail system. So Mao's economic model also followed his revolutionary model. And now the Great Leap Forward launched in 58. So 1949 to 52 was a period when they're trying to basically go back to where they were before the war and revolutionary efforts and a great disruption. So they're repairing the damage to the economy. At the same time, they are having this revolution in the countryside where the peasants are taking land from the rich peasants. And that was what the book of William Hinton, Paul Fanchon records what was going on. worth reading. So the economy was revived and grew with this strategy. The Great Leap Forward, launched in '58, where to try to develop industry based on peasant communes, was partly successful, partly a disaster, but it was not a complete disaster. Before the Cultural Revolution launched in 1966 by Mao himself, Chinese economy had impressive gains. This is not advertised either by the present government there or by the government in the capitalist countries. Of course, they don't want to, right? Between 1952 to 66, a period of 14 years, including the Great Leap Forward with a lot of mistakes in that, and terrible things happen. And the bad years of 1960, 61, there was a failure of harvest due to climatic reason mainly, and withdrawal of Soviet technicians because of Mao's fight with Khrushchev. Chinese communists had criticized Khrushchev for his revisionism and denouncing of Stalin. And Khrushchev basically cut off the aid, had all the technicians take their whatever the equipment they had back to Soviet Union, and there was no more aid. And then there's a crop failure. So the double whammy really affected them. And a lot of people died in that. The exaggeration of numbers, I'm sure, but a lot of people did die. But part of it was, I think, the Great Leap Forward mistakes too. So, but including all that, there's still overall 11% per year growth. That's a very impressive growth between 52 and 66. Anyway, so now Khrushchev's revisionism in the USSR I mentioned earlier, which began to return the economy towards capitalism, had a deeper impression on Mao. Mao saw how quickly after Stalin's death things changed in the USSR. So his conclusion was that the Communist Party and Stalin had not kept itself connected with the poor working masses. After all, communists are supported. They're working for the poorest of the poor, the poorest workers, the poorest peasants, landless peasants, poor peasants, eking out something what Lenin calls semi-proletarians. They are the natural base. And how is it that Khrushchev could so easily turn this whole thing around? So now we know that until mid-1930s, at least mid-1930s, maybe late 1930s, the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was very closely connected to these poor people, which is vast majority, 80 to 85% of the people. Krupskaya's biography of Lenin, I don't know how many of you have read it, but she notes this in her book. But then in the intense preparation for war, which began right in 1933, because as soon as Hitler takes power, Stalin tells his party that we are going to be attacked. We have at best 10 years. We either prepare or they will destroy us. And then war came in 8 years after that. So Stalin was a little bit off. So entire attention of the party in Stalin pretty substantially had to be in developing, and it was not just developing war industry, it was developing education, infrastructure, economy, plus war industry. So I don't know. I mean, to me, it seems to me it was a monumental achievement under Stalin that happened. But in the process, I mean, there was also this opposition that developed within the party, and that began in the mid-20s with Trotsky at the head of it, but Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, all pulling different directions. from the economic plan that was continued by the party, which was alliance with peasantry and continuing the new economic policy. And from there, that thing, they came back. Most of them came back. For Trotsky didn't. He was expelled. But this opposition then got to the point where they also believed that Soviet Union will be defeated by Germany. After all, Germany had defeated Soviet Union, Russia before. They didn't see how this backward country could fight and defeat much more modern and so they, between their own egotistical idea, but more importantly, their defeatism. There was an attempt to overthrow Stalin-led government, and which is where the repressions came, and then there were lots of things that happened in it, and unknown to even Stalin, heads of the police, secret police and police, NKVD, which is Ministry of Internal Security, they were also involved in this partly. And so there's a lot of intrigue there and things that happen. So ultimately, Stalin put it right, but a lot of damage was done. And in that, I think the party probably suffers some detachment from its base. I don't know that for sure, but Mao's fear may have been applicable in that part, some after or certainly it's the start of the war, when it was in any case difficult to travel and all that. So Mao saw beginning of the detachment of the party from its base and more reliance on experts and upper level communist managers as weakness of Stalin model, which was the later model during the war, etc. Happening in China as well as by mid-1960s, it was happening. He saw this happening here. Liu Shaoqi, president of China, an important ally, was a leftist with Mao early, and writers like Deng Xiaoping, right from the beginning, in the party, in his estimation, were like Khrushchev and Bukharin in the USSR, and were moving towards profit incentives and expert control of economy. So again, that disease of capitalist profit making comes back. So that is why Mao unleashed the Cultural Revolution, lasting from 66 technically to 76, but which had substantially by 1972 over, after it went out of control. And here the history is pretty muddy. Lin Biao and Mao's wife are blamed for it, but the story is certainly more complicated. I think it's true that People's Liberation Army leaders saw danger in their own position and sided with the rightists when this thing was getting too close to them. And that ended the Cultural Revolution. As a result, the power shifted to the rightists, who now were led by Deng Xiaoping. Mao was sidelined, and his last 40, I think he also suffered a stroke. And he died in 76. In 1978, 2 years after Mao's death, Communist Party led by Deng turned towards capitalism, initially privatizing the land, giving it to for individual cultivators, and some could handle it, others couldn't. They had to go to the cities, which means rural proletarians were being created. Now, how to solve their problem? And he solved it by 89, inviting capital from Western countries, United States and Europe. So that's what happened. That's Deng Xiaoping bringing China to the capitalist road, as Khrushchev had done in Soviet Union. Today, it is a one-party dominated state. China can only be accurately described as state capitalism, with more billionaires than any other country, with a quarter of its population living on $5.50 per day income, an inequality index the same as the US. But it's a big economy, and total GDP is estimated to pass the US economy in 2028. So what Stalin could not prevent in Russia, Bolshevik Party yielding to a tendency towards capitalism, restoration of capitalism in a socialist state, Mao also could not do it in China. In USSR, after Khrushchev's revisionism, a transition towards capitalist restoration was disguised as reform, okay? And then overthrow of the formal socialist state. In China, it came with Deng's reforms with complete dishonesty, labeled as socialism with Chinese characteristics. So you go figure what that means and tell me what it means if you think it means something else other than huckstering, in my opinion. So I come to the next point, is the commodification, alienation, and ecology. The effect of capitalist production on alienation of labor in turns, now I'm going back to Marx again, turns leads to alienation of one human being from another. That's the source. That stealing of labor, making the person completely free of everything. Free means he cannot produce commodities on his own. Basically, he's becoming trapped in the system simply as a wage labor. I mean, there is a small percentage of those who can do it, but vast majority, 90% cannot do it. So that's a source of alienation that you experience. All that other manifestation that you see in the movies, Bollywood or Hollywood and all these things, you see that, okay? They romanticize it, but that's the basis of it. But the need for love and affection remains, and people try to find it where they can. Churches, temples, mosques, where we're told God will protect us and that God loves us. But again, the hustling and huckstering that's going out in work life gets inside these places as well. So before COVID, shopping malls were effectively replacing churches, temples, and mosques, at least among those who had some money or could borrow money. And that's the other thing, borrowing money. I mean, if you don't have money, borrow money. And so not just in the US, it's all over the world going on. Commodity was filling the void left in the human heart from alienation. But it remains a fraud. For the genuine need of love of another human being cannot be fulfilled by dead labor, no matter how attractive it may appear in the form of a commodity at that moment. I don't know how many of you remember My Pet Rock. That was 1970 or thereabouts. Pet rock craze. Well, that's love in because the pet is a live animal, and it gives you something back. It relates to you. But the pet rock was, you didn't have to worry about taking care of it. You didn't have to take it for a walk. You didn't have to clean its excretions. Anyway, in my last talk here with you, the logic of capitalist production in ecology, I pointed out that Earth's average surface temperature has risen about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century. Okay, that's a little over 100 years, 125 years. A change driven largely by increased carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. Most of the warming occurred in the past 40 years. Okay, most of this warming has come in the last 40 years, 60% of it. 2019 was the second warmest year on record. And also there were 6 warmest years on record were taking place in the last 20 years. This period is when China emerged as a major commodity producer, adding to the already great greenhouse gas emissions of other capitalist countries, created the new liberal capital-driven consumers. So China is the latest in this whole thing. The rise of China leads the US to try and control the world as it is slipping away to a new rival. And race is once again between the US and subordinate capitalist countries on one hand, that's Europe and Japan, and China, Russia, Iran, etc. on the other. China is today what America was 1950, or maybe China has gone further, maybe in the 60s, China China is where it is. Military industrial complex of the United States, I know that for sure, but also growing in China now, pretty significantly, is perhaps the greatest single polluter in the world. So that's another important element to the ecological disaster facing humanity. So anyway, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. Give me 5 minutes and we'll wrap it up. Socialism and ecology, I'll go there. The new economic policy in the USSR lasted 7 years, 1921 to 28. Then Stalin, they went for a socialist economy. 7 years they had to deal with under Lenin to allow trading and kind of restore the economy, kind of like China, 49 to 52. So in Russia, it was 7 years. It was ended in 28. And then that's when we went for socialist industrialization and semi-socialist agriculture. Socialist construction took from there on 13 years. By 1940, USSR became a successful socialist country, transitioning from feudal capitalism, while its economy had to be geared to military productions. So the consumer sector suffered, naturally, but it helped the USSR destroy the fascist Nazi menace for themselves and thankfully for the rest of the world. If we have any sense, we should be thanking that every day. While technology could hardly be the main focus of this period of transition, by 1953, the economy of the USSR had laid the basis of a non-commodity relations of human beings with each other and with nature. The plan was to meet the needs of the working people, not for profit, and that's the key. USSR did that within the system of socialism. People's lives improved, and if that had continued, it had the potential, at least, to save the planet from the ecological nightmare we face today. So I'm about finishing. So Stalin asked this question in 1 year before his, I think, end of his life in 53. Is there a basic economic law of socialism? And of course, typical of Stalin, he answered it. He had a ready answer. He said, yes, there is. What are the essential features and requirements of this law? The essential features and requirements of the basic law of socialism might be formulated roughly in this way. The securing of the maximum satisfaction of the constantly rising material and cultural requirements of the whole of society through the continuous expansion and perfection of socialist production on the basis of higher techniques. So that definition is not the same as the consumerism that we have talked about, of which China, unfortunately, has been a partner of the US in the past 30 years. So the consumerism under neoliberal capitalism, capitalism in general, is causing ecological damage on a huge scale. And a lot of it is cumulative, meaning the past pollution from greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stays, and new gets added to it. China plans to continue on that path for 2 to 3 decades. I think it's 3 decades, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not arguing that people live a bare existence to save the planetary ecology. No, the planetary ecology and people are connected. It is neither, the ecology is not something to use and throw away, I mean, just as a trash it, nor is it something that we turn it into God, and which some idealists do. But it is that eliminating destructive forces of capitalism, which is now again in a monopoly stage, the highest stage, once again, as it was in 1916, interrupted by the 2 big world wars, which reduced a lot of capital, killed over 100 million people. So a huge cost, but that's what gave it another impetus, but that also finished by 1970s. But what was good enough in 1952 when Stalin said all that is not good enough now, in my opinion. We have to move more quickly from capitalism to socialism and more quickly from socialism to communism. And in doing that, we have to redefine what is wealth and good life. Don't accept the capitalist definition of good life, consumerism. And with that, I thank you. And I end my presentation and we can discuss it. I'm sure there are lots of comments on this.
Okay, thank you, Raj. Before we go into questions and comments, we'll have some announcements. Jean, would you give us a preview of what's coming up in the next few weeks?
Yes, I will. And it is on our webpage at ICSS Mark, so you can read more about it there. We also have our, today's will be, recording will be posted there probably by this evening. Mehmet does a very good job of that. But next week, we have collective worker action in the tech industry. We'll be looking at the history of collective action taken by workers in the tech industry and the current state. So this is kind of the cutting edge of a lot of what's going on in the world today. Savish Rajasankaran and another person named Kristen will be the speakers. They're both active in the tech industry, and at least one of them has been active with the Bernie campaign. Following that, we have John Holmes will be speaking on the history of the US working class, something we're very interested in. And that's coming up. Then we have a number of very interesting programs coming up, but we don't have them scheduled. I guess Raj is working on getting a confirmation from our friend, our comrade, Rover Fur. So we do have more, and they will be posted as soon as we work out our schedule coming up. Now, I did try to post our financial information, how you can contribute to the ICSS. Unfortunately, for some reason, I can't copy and paste things into the chat room, but it's on our webpage, icssmarks.org, if you want to contribute. And I don't know if Richard wants to say any more about that, but I'll finish with that.
Okay, thank you, Jean. As I mentioned at the beginning, the ICSS, we're trying to intensify our activities. One of the ways we do it, many of the ways we do it, is asking for your participation. Most important way is intellectually. If you can make a presentation, make suggestions, that I think it'd be very useful. You know, we feel very much in the planning committee our inadequacy and with the task before us, and we look forward to other people outside the immediate area. The next week's program was arranged by our friend in Texas, and you know, if anybody else wants to contribute in that way or in any other ways, one of the easiest ways is financial, and I have posted some information on the chat just this few minutes ago, how you can do it through PayPal or through your bank account or old-fashioned checks in the mail and so forth. We're trying to increase the outreach of the ICSS, and that's going to cost money and improve our software. And also we continue to support the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library, which is our physical home and our spiritual home. So thank you in advance for that. So now we'll have the question and answer and discussion. This will be moderated. on the expectation that there will be a lot of people wanting to ask questions, we'll initially limit the comments to 2 minutes. If that's not enough, we can increase it, and we'll also allow second hands going up. So the first two people I see are Sharon and Yusuf. Sharon, would you lower your hand and unmute yourself and begin? Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. I just have a couple of comments. My main comment is that Raj made the point, the very important point, that capitalism will never be able to change the trajectory of climate change that we are on now, and which is a complete and utter disaster. And I think that Raj did explain what he meant, but I think we need to spend more time talking about why that is, because we need to convince a lot of other people, that is the majority of the population of the United States and elsewhere. And I think that I know that when I say that to friends, many of them say, well, why not? And then I try to talk about commodity production like Raj was saying, but I think it needs a lot more understanding among Marxists, and then so that we can talk to other people. I wanted to just say a couple words about China. So I think that it's objectively the case that limiting population growth worldwide is a good thing. And that in terms of combating climate change, it's not the ultimate, it's not the silver bullet, it's not the ultimate solution, but I think it's a good thing. And I think I've shared this before, but I'm going to share it again. So I met a scholar from Tsinghua University in Beijing who told me, this was 10 years ago, before the relaxation of the one-child policy, he told me that all of the mathematical models, and he was a political economist, all of the mathematical models that they are using at the university say that by the end of this century, there will be only half the population of the current population of China. That is to say, there will only be 750 million people. And when he said that, I gasped. And we talked about, that it had to do with the one-child policy. Now that policy has been relaxed, but I assert that does not mean that there's going to be a fundamentally changed population growth in China. That is to say, a huge baby boom that will go on indefinitely. And the reason I say that is that educated women in China would be very happy to have only one child. And I know I have this on very good authority. And more women are educated. And of course, there's a lot of pressure on them from their families, their parents and their in-laws to have more than one child. But in any case, I think that you can't just say that because they lifted the one-child policy, it means that there won't be this population decline that was being predicted by the models. And I think I'm over time, so I'll stop. But I think we should also consider that 400, or maybe it's now up to 500 million people being lifted from poverty. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that they're dumped into the consumer economy. It means very basic things about being out of poverty. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Next person is Yusuf, followed by Jean, and then Anne. Lewis. Go ahead, Gene.
Or Yusuf.
Yusuf, sorry. Sorry. Yusuf, unmute
Oh,
yourself.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Raj, thank you for a very informative, excellent presentation. But I think what could be added is a problem that in the Marxist, in the model of Marx imagined that a socialist revolution will take place in advanced capitalist countries, where you already were at this stage when technology will already centralize planning, when there are already enough enough essentials, plus the perks to go around to every person, and the problem would be that of distribution. This would it turned out not to be the case, and the problem faced by both Soviet Union and China was that you had a working class leadership in fairly backward countries. So they and I think this led to some of the problems that you have to both develop industry, technology, and develop socialism. And sometimes, well, the industry, the technology lagged behind the ideal required for socialism. The
Yes.
second.
Go ahead.
A second point is that I think one should make a distinction between which class is in state power and the state of the economy. At present, the working class is still in state power. It's the major. Okay, some capitalists have been given some stake in it, but well, they're sort of guests. And the main state power is in the hands of the working class. It's in the hands of the Communist Party. Whereas in Russia, it is you have it's a capitalist country. It's a state capitalist country because there's not enough private enterprise to go around. But the state power, the class in power, is the capitalist class. And I think a distinction should be made.
Places are not backward.
I would like to respond briefly to Yusuf's two comments. No comment on to Sharon, because except briefly on Sharon.
Go ahead, Raj.
Okay, about Sharon, I want to response to Sharon is that I think the idea of birth control by the state is a repressive thing. Now, it may be under certain circumstances, it could be justified, but really is an inhumane thing. What needs to happen is that I have never met, I mean, I come from India, so I talk to a lot of women of previous generation, including my mother and others, who were not very highly educated, I mean, not even high school, okay? But none of them, these older women, ever told me they'll have more than 1 or 2 children if this power was within themselves, because their clients were pushing them. And so I think basically what I found is once a person is socially, and why they were pushing it is basically the pressure of the males were treated better in society, could bring money, and for the poor, children becomes a source of income. Once you remove all those things, then breeding starts on its own. I mean, the problem in Italy is the reverse, right? I mean, they don't, in Russia, they're against, they're not having. So I think this, maybe I'm not saying that it was not needed in China, and I'm glad they're relaxing it. So that's on that part, but it's inhumane. I mean, we should be building a society that allows people to get where they can be kind and to each other, and this should not be dictated by the government. So that's my objection to it. Now on to Yusuf. Yusuf, your first point that Marx thought that, nowhere does Marx say that, by the way. This is your assumption. And by the way, this is Trotskyism coming through you. Okay, this is the Trotskyist idea that backward society like peasants cannot make a revolution. In fact, Mao's writing on 1871 Commune, Paris Commune, was that the Paris communards didn't have time to get to the peasantry, okay, to make them allies. Because semi-proletarians, not all them, but semi-proletarians of the countryside are perfect allies. And that's what history has shown. To say that they are backward, this is actually what is Trotskyism, elitism. So it's the suffering person who works, ekes out a living, who's honest. And that's the foundation of Lenin's thinking, and it was Marx's thinking. Lenin is not actually, Lenin is developing it. It's coming from Marx. So that's my objection to it. I forget your second point about, remind me, what was the second point, one quickly?
State power versus the economy.
I don't think state power today in China can be said to be in the hands of the working class. There's a single party. I mean, this is what happened in Soviet Union. I mean, was Khrushchev representing the working class? Do you think the Chinese workers who eke out a $5.50 existence, and I'm not saying this as an arrogant thing, in India, there are more of them. I'm even more harsher on India than I'm saying is about China. But do you think they're saying, thank God, the government is letting me get exploited? Is that what you're saying the working class is saying? There's a contradiction. I mean, you can't be a Marxist and argue like a capitalist.
Okay.
Because you're saying the working class controls the party of China, and in turn, they bring in jobs to them. Well, that's the Republican Party argument. That's not a Marxist argument.
Okay, but they take the example of Soviet Union under Lenin. There was a conscious decision to allow a new economic policy, to allow a certain degree of capitalism, because they felt that the conditions required it. Also, let me add that I didn't want to use backward in a pejorative term. I was talking about the technology, not about the people. But I think, clearly, Marx, reading Marx, the technology and the progression from feudalism to capitalism, or from slavery to feudalism to capitalism, they're tied in with the technology.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Let's move on to somebody, another, Gene. Would you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to start by introducing my pet rock. It has never been a commodity and never will be a commodity. It was produced with the very loving hands of my granddaughter, who you can see the little eyes she painted on there. So again, I just wanted to introduce my pet rock here. He's enjoying, but it's not binary. No, we don't use binary things for rocks. But, well, thank you very much, Raj. As usual, this was very provocative, and we've had this discussion for a long time. And I was particularly glad to see, first of all, that Raj and I kind of went through graduate school or postdoctoral study together when we read all 3 volumes of Capital together. And our comrade Kambis is here. It's great to see Kambi's here, and I hope he will contribute because he was one of our mentors during that period. So I just want to make that point. And Raj and I are very good comrades, which means we can be very frank with each other. And he will not be surprised when I say he's just flat out wrong on his interpretation of China. Basically correct on the Soviet Union. We both agree that the Soviet Revolution and Stalin's role there was world historic and transformed the world. But in the case of China, we need to deal with facts, not opinions. And the fact of the matter is, although it is true that China is the largest polluter in the world, this is not true on a per capita basis. The United States remains the largest polluter in the world. The average Chinese per capita pollution by China is less than 1/2 of that of the United States. So I think that's very important. Secondly, China's very, there was a period because China needed to provide for its people, and it did lift 800 people out of extreme poverty and has eliminated extreme poverty. And that is a feat that has only been equaled by the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin, where the world was transformed. So I think that's important to bear in mind. Again, they had to transform and provide for the basic necessities for people, which they have done. And that was their biggest priority. Now that that has been accomplished, they are turning to other things, particularly creating an ecological situation. So China produces more windmills than any other country in the world. It has planted more trees than any other, I think more than all other countries in the world. So China is working very hard at producing an ecological situation. And they're very, very frank about what they refer to themselves in their constitution as a socialist society governed by a democratic dictatorship of the workers and led by workers and peasants, which they say is in essence the dictatorship of the proletariat. And that is precisely the terminology that the Soviet Union, the Lenin, used to describe the Soviet transformation. And finally, I have many more, but I'll stop with this one. The Chinese government is overwhelmingly, the Communist Party of China is overwhelmingly supported by the people of China. They get something like a 90% approval rating in the polls in terms of, and they're very sensitive to the polls, and they're very interactive with the people of China. So I just want to make those points.
Okay, thank you. I've been relaxing the 2-minute rule a little bit because there were relatively few, but now that we have some more, the next person to speak will be Anne Lewis, followed by Kambiz, Sakai, and Richard W. Go ahead, Anne.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thanks to Raj and express my total agreement that we have to do something about neoliberal capitalism if we're going to deal with the current crisis in the ecology of the planet. My question, and this is again in kind of what Sharon was saying about what do we say to people? As believers in that very important principle, and as believers in questions around commodity production, what gets thrown at us is, and I'm just going to throw a couple of things out. For example, technology, which is really the development of technology is seen as a way for workers and, for development, for economic development under socialism. Technology sometimes is an utter disaster for the planet. And I'll just give you a quick example, strip mining, which is probably the most devastating ecological disaster for huge swaths of land, is a technological development. you know, so my question is, what do we say when people say, but it doesn't solve, socialism doesn't solve the ecological crisis, much as we would like it to?
Okay, can I respond to that?
Yes, go ahead, Raj.
And thank you.
Laura.
And Gene and I continuously talk, so I don't need to respond to Gene. I just disagree with him. Yeah, I think first of all, there's a massive propaganda against socialism ever since socialist revolution took place. So because of this propaganda and because of the defeat that socialism suffered at the hands of revisionists, both in Russia and China, what has come to be seen as socialism can easily then be described as something bad. So if Soviet Union was trying to match, because otherwise it'll be bombed by nuclear bombs to create nuclear thing, and they have an accident, that's blamed on socialism. But whatever happens in the Western world in that regard, when they were testing nuclear weapons, killed a lot of people. They even experimented on people with that radiation. And then that happened off the Japan by the ocean. All of that suddenly doesn't get blamed on capitalism, but whatever happened under socialism get blamed to socialism. So this is a propaganda thing, but eventually I have faith that 7.5 billion people of the planet is not going to allow them to be smothered by capitalist-made ecological disaster. They will suffer a lot. I mean, a lot of people will die. And that's what happened in the two revolutions, both Russian and Chinese. And they're two very glorious revolutions, from both of which we can take inspiration, of course, also learn from their mistakes. But I think to the extent we explain to people, look, don't just buy this thing that comes up on your CNN or MSNBC or New York Times. You have to critically think about this thing. But if you don't do critical thinking, and that's why we call ourselves Institute for Critical Study of Society. And I'm thankful that one of the founder and a great Marxist philosopher is with us, in my opinion, Marxist philosopher, Camby's. So he can address some of that. But I think propaganda is there and it succeeds for a time. But when the time comes, it doesn't have an effect. So individually, I think we should make our effort, but there will come a wave. I mean, the signs of which are apparent, what happened, people are gravitating towards a guy like Trump. Why? Because there's no redeeming feature to the guy other than the fact he's not not like the other politicians who have been saying we are working for you while they work for the capitalist class. And he came out, was more blunt, and all of a sudden, so I think we have to continue our critique of society. And there are some gains, like on the front of women, among Dalits in India and among Blacks, which are both Dalit caste, in a sense, they're both caste. So I think the struggle is a long and hard one. I don't have an automatic answer. There's no simple answer, but we have to struggle. That's why we call the term struggle. Anyway, sorry.
Okay, let's go on to Camby's, and we'll maybe have a couple of questioners and then come back for Raj if he wants to respond. So next Camby's, and then Richard W., Laura Wells, and then Yusuf for a second round. Go ahead, Camby's.
Your microphone
Please
is off.
yourself. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Raj, and also thank you for your kind words, and also Jean. I really appreciate it. I'm embarrassed how kind you are. I wanted to say that I agree with the gist of your discussion, Raj, regarding the relationship, intrinsic relationship between capitalism and the environmental problems that we are facing. I think you're right. Capitalism has an instrumental approach to everything, including environment. And as a result of that, it's only the use and abuse of environment that is the concern of capitalism. And as long as we are living in this system, there will not be a solution to our problems with the environment. And I also think it is very important to pay attention to what we intend by socialism. Because if we understand capitalism as basically alienation of human beings from their nature, and what is our nature? Our nature is self-creation, the ability to create ourselves and our world. This is how Marx looks at human beings, that they are God. God in the sense of the ability to create our own world and our own self and our environment. And if we are destroying the environment in which we are living, it's because we are alienated from our own nature. And we need to get it back, reappropriate it. And that is only possible through elimination of capitalism and establishment of communism. But communism has to be this, has to take care of this non-alienated way of life, that is the ability to create our own life. And I think socialism in the past versions of it had this thing distorted a little bit or a lot, depending which country we are talking about. And we need for the future to recover that dimension of Marx's thought, that is the process of de-alienation and reappropriation of human nature.
3 minutes.
Thank you.
I wouldn't comment on that. I learned my Marxism from Gambis, aside from what life teaches you. But formally, I learned from him. I would just say that the difficulty is in the transitional phase. And I agree there are lots of mistakes made and bad things happen. So we have to acknowledge that. But I don't think we could eliminate in one swoop the complete thing, from capitalism to communism. And so the whole problem lies in the transitional stage. And I don't have an answer, Kambis, on that any more than anybody else, how to get here. Lenin had a thought on that, Stalin had a thought, and Mao had a thought, and they all were kind of partially successful and partially failures, So anyway, next.
The next person is Richard W. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you. I so dearly wanted to comment on the history of the Soviet Union, but what I really found interesting was in the chat was this discussion of in China of the one child policy, and in the sense that it really raises the issue of really what Marxism is about, in that Marxism is really about political economy. So there's the economic part of it, but there's also the political part of it. And there's one child policy that was raised. It was interesting in part because what is given to us, and I've gotten this from my friend from Nan, who is Chinese and was raised during this period, is that in point of fact, the one China policy was basically restricted to the eastern cities. That in point of fact, that was not a uniform policy as far as regions, nor was it a uniform policy as regarding ethnic groups. For example, the Uyghurs were allowed to have more than one child, in order to balance out the influence of the Han. But it also raises an interesting question of as Marxists, how do we handle differences when a political policy is arrived at democratically? Because I think the Chinese came to this policy after a very broad discussion amongst a very large number of people. And they collectively came to this conclusion that it was necessary at the time in order to deal with their scarce resources that they had. So that raises the question of, as a socialist or as a communist, how do you deal with a decision that is arrived at democratically that you disagree with? And I'll just leave it there. I mean, that's a topic I think would be interesting to explore. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. And the next person is Laura Wells. Go ahead, Laura.
Well, I have questions about the Americas. And it has to do with Latin America as part of it. What do you think about the pink tide? At what point in the transition is that? I know Hugo Chavez talked about socialism for the 21st century, and Bolivia and Ecuador were important countries in that pink tide, and it looks like they're taking back their countries toward that direction. And they're looking toward China for some like financial, for some help in various ways, Venezuela and others. And then also this country, I know that people say, well, we need a revolution, we don't need reforms. Well, I'm not sure whether people are saying we don't need reforms. That has to do with what my question is. Do you think that reforms are like a transition toward the transition of socialism, or does it sort of further placate the people who are needed to realize that what we basically need is a revolution? Do you know what I'm saying? But the examples, like things like Medicare for all, things like free higher education for everybody, things like universal basic income, and then other things like public banks and things like that. Are those things worth working for as like a transition toward the transition of socialism? I guess you'd say democratic socialism, to give it a big a term, and the Green New Deal as opposed to the old 1930s New Deal that didn't actually consider the environment that much. So anyway, that's what my question, it has to do with what do you think about Latin America, what's happening there, and reform, democratic socialism, Green New Deal here in the United States as a transition. Thank you. And thanks very much for your presentation.
Thank you. I don't know that much, but whatever I know about Latin American so-called pink tide is the struggle against US domination of the subcontinent. And that itself is a very important thing. Soviet Union and China both supported this domination of capitalist countries. Under Mao, they supported it, and under both even Khrushchev and much more so in Stalin, Khrushchev both supported it. Vietnam War could not have been won by the National Liberation Front without that. So there's a contribution they made. Now, this anti-imperialist struggle where there's such a stranglehold of American capital and American power over Latin America, South America, is important, I think. But whether or not it leads to revolution, I don't know. I don't think it is possible to contain the revolution once reform efforts are made and people are mobilized. Often they just overthrow the system. And then somebody like the United States will come and kill these leaders, etc. Like Che was killed. They tried to kill, of course, Fidel so many times. So that will do. They tried to kill Zhou Enlai when he was flying to Bandung conference and on aboard Air India, Indian Airlines plane, which was flying him his thing, and of course he didn't the last minute travel on the plane. I think that's how they used to kind of do it, and so he survived. But almost everybody was killed on the plane, except for the pilot and the navigator, both Indian, which were picked up. So anyway, this struggle is there, and as for pressure for reform, like Bernie Sanders, those are good steps. I think those steps are within that. That doesn't mean we reject them because they will not lead to. I think the socialism, all those demands, those are. He's making working class demand on the system. So I think we have to support that demand without agreeing to becoming part of the Democratic Party or Bernie's party. If there is a party that demands that, I think we should support it. But it will not lead to reform like reform that Roosevelt did was actually to preserve the system. The Communist Party of the United States, of which there are several members here, it was playing a revolutionary role in organizing workers, and tremendous sacrifices were made by them to try and overthrow the system. And in the case of they made an agreement, devil's bargain, that New Deal, and
Okay.
that preserved it. Sorry, I've gone too long.
Okay. Next, we'll have Gulden, followed by Yusuf, and then I will speak. Go ahead, Gulden.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The reason we are saying that we can't accomplish any environmental cleanup, environmental progress in capitalism is because of the lifestyle so far we adopted in capitalism, like the amount of plastics we are bringing home and the amount of cars we are using and the factories, etc. So this as long as this lifestyle hasn't changed, we won't be able to clean up our environment and make any progress around that, cleaning up. So it's exactly saying that if your husband is beating you every day, you can't just turn around and ask his help for the domestic violence. That's what's happening in capitalism. And my question is, as socialists, there is like garbage islands floating in the Pacific right now. Are we going to just bind our arms and just saying that, okay, we have to just wait until we establish socialism, we establish communism. We can't do anything right now as long as we live in the capitalism. So what do we do right now? Do we wait? Or do we have to do something about it? Thank you.
I don't have exact answer, but I think you struggle for cleaner environment. And I think when all these struggles are unified, capitalism will be overthrown. That's what I believe. The emancipation of low caste people and blacks here, Dalits in India, and that kind of gradation of people's, oppressed people, oppressed peasantry who own the land, their means of production, but they can't survive on it, like in India. And all these other things, commodity production, etc., where so much garbage comes in, the more determined I get about not having plastics in my home, still I'm not able to prevent it. You're right. It's kind of just about impossible. You have to live like a hermit somewhere to do that. So I think the struggle, even for reform, is the way. I mean, that's what wage demands and they're going on. The women were the ones who led the wage reform and struggle that forced the timing of the insurrection in Russia. So I think it's a complicated thing. I don't pretend to know that. Many mothers, people here might know. I mean, your own husband might know better, Mehmet, than you might along with him know better than me. But I think my history reading of that process is that it emerges organically. But you have to struggle for cleaner environment and try to reduce on individual level as much as you can. But actually, you can't give up. And in the process somewhere, I think we'll prepare the ground for eventual overthrow. Richard,
Next
you can.
person is Yusuf. Please go ahead.
Okay, well, I want to take issue a little with what our friend Anne said, is that technology is something bad, it pollutes. And the example of strip mining is actually very low tech. It's very crude technology. It could have been done in the 19th century and before it. I mean, it's lower technology than conventional mining. And the importance of technology, and also I want to underline that I don't have content for the present. I started my talk a couple of weeks ago with example of a communist movement among peasants in early 15th century Ottoman Empire. But of course, the reason that it didn't succeed is that if it was done in any substantial scale, people were distributing evenly sharing what's available, everybody would end up with very little and probably beyond survival capacity. So technology is important, and I think Marx repeatedly gives the example against the movement, like the Luddites that were present in his time, the anti-technology movement in his time.
I just want to quickly add some comment to that. While I agree with you, yes, Marx, but we shouldn't accept everything in the name of technology and science, because capitalism is using it for one purpose only, for accumulation and abuse of both human beings and of society. One of the basic contradictions is, as has been written about, and the latest book is by Charles Andrews on automation, right? The Hollow Colossus that he wrote. And the question is, automation, which machinery and technology, which is in computer science now, has both aspects. We're able to talk to each other, and they can control our lives because they can monitor, and they can, look, everybody can see how you're spending money and make you a consumerist and so forth. So there are two aspects of it. And the critique of science is a relatively a new thing from a Marxist perspective. But science and technology is not neutral. And while we are not rejecting it, it will have a different form under socialism and communism. So the communism is not going to be what Kambiz is describing. I don't think he intends communism is going back to the old society, and what Jean calls ancestral communism. Okay, no, it'll be communism of modernity, and if I have means, which I mean, if machines can be used for production, why don't the workers have more leisure and cultural development? That's the point. The point of it is that. Okay, thank you.
I agree with you 100%.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go next, and then Jean, and then Richard W. Yeah, I think this whole question of socialism and the attitude of Marxists to socialist societies, or putative, supposedly socialist societies, is a very complex one. And I think it leads to great problems. You know, we talk about which side are we on? Well, we should talk about which side are we on. And we find that many radicals or leftists for various reasons, take an anti-China and anti-Russian. You know, the anti-Russian position is normal now among the left. And the Russian anti-China one is not so normal, but it's certainly there. And I think we have to deal with that. And theoretically, and it's a very complex problem. I think the problem, for instance, the use of market methods and private ownership of the means of production in socialist societies has to be looked at very carefully. I think the success of China in using that to develop itself and to entangle the world capitalist system in with the Chinese socialist system is an incredible triumph. It's comparable to the buildup of the Soviet Union during the 30s in preparation for World War II. It's forestalled an imperialist military aggression and makes it more difficult. I think the development of new atomic weapons in Russia and the development of its economy has also and using capitalist methods to some extent is an important victory for the working class. And so, you know, we can't go into it in detail now, but I don't think we can simply look at the development of certain kind of relations in these countries as proof positive that they're moving in a negative direction. Okay, next.
Can I comment quickly on that? Will you let me?
Yes, so, yeah.
Okay, so very quickly, what I would say is analyzing China and saying these are not socialist countries anymore, that they are state capitalism, Russia and China, does not mean being anti-Russia and anti-China any more than when Lenin called Germany a imperialist power to be anti-German. He basically called for his own country's defeat, right? In the war, that would have enormous consequences had Germany completely devastated Russia of its time. But he said a working class cannot come to power without it. I think we should take the same position. We should, without saying China is socialist, because I think that's a fraud, or Russia as a socialist, I think that would be a fraud. And Marxists have to be honest, say they're not. But they're not. But the point is, that's not anti-Russian or anti-Chinese position. I think you have to combine with saying that first and foremost, we look for defeat of US imperialism. So that's our first business and first obligation. I agree with that position. That's a Leninist position.
Okay, Gene, you're up. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I understand many people have some issues with the existing socialist countries, which is entirely normal. I mean, no one says that emerging socialist country is going to behave the way we want it to. It's determined by their own internal dynamics. And in this, remind everybody that I believe it was Friday, was Rosa Luxemburg's birthday. And she was murdered, I think, 98 years ago during the German Revolution. But one of the things she said with reference to, I think it was Brest-Litovsk, the Russian Revolution, she disagreed with it. They're saying they made a mistake. They shouldn't have done that. But then she said, but show me the revolution that has not made a mistake. And she said, then she continued to something to the effect that even the idea that revolutions don't make mistake is worthy only of the schoolmasters of the Second International, who knew absolutely what they should do when a world war break out is, not approve any war expenditures. They knew that's what they should do. And what happened when the issue came up? They all supported the war. So I think Rosa Luxemburg has a lot to say on this, and we need to understand that, yes, there's lots of things that go on in China, just as there are in the Soviet Union, but that doesn't mean the general direction that they're going is incorrect. And as you all know, my favorite Marxist these days is Xi Jinping for China. And in the United States, it's my friend Bernie Sanders, if not AOC. But anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And I think, the last person to speak will be Richard. And after that, we will go into the general free-for-all. And so go ahead, Richard.
Thank you, Gene, for the observation about your favorite Marxist being Xi Jinping. I wanted to weigh in on this technology issue. Before this session started, I happened to have on Fareed Zakaria, and he was interviewing Eric Schmidt, who was one of the co-founders of Google, and he was weighing in very much on he was fear-mongering. I mean, he was talking about artificial intelligence and how the United States had to catch up to China. And the reason I bring that up is because it sort of highlights the difference between the two models. Of course, we have here, the technology is very much beholden to the military-industrial complex, for one, and in furthering the interest of the capitalists making money from going to war. My understanding is that in China, I'm not saying that they don't use artificial intelligence for military purposes. Clearly, I mean they do, or they will, but like in this last the COVID-19, they were going door to door using artificial intelligence to identify people who were potentially infected. And it was a policy to basically to protect their people as a whole. And I think that sort of highlights one of the differences between technology under a capitalist military-industrial society and if you want to call it state capitalism, so be it. But nevertheless, once again, I think the Chinese are a little bit more concerned about the well-being of their population than we are. And I think that extends to other areas, such as the environment. I mean, yes, they do have a lot of pollution there, but they are working on correcting that. Okay, I'll stop there.
I want to comment on both Gene and Richard W.'s last comments. See, I mean, the thing is that you have to have some principles from which you determine this. Marxists are not simply saying, okay, because Chinese Communist Party today says we're socialist, and they build a capitalist economy, and anybody who voices anything gets into jail, okay, call it dictatorship of the proletariat, is more intolerant than what is you accuse of Stalin. In Stalin, saw Dr. Zhivago, right? It was criticism of system and some very severe criticism of it. Its writer never went to jail. He lived on. Okay, the point is that you cannot call what is capitalism as socialism, because then you will completely confuse it, everybody. You'll never take him there. This is the kind of obfuscation that we Marxists have to end. That's my point. The point is, you're saying, okay, Raj, it's just your opinion because you're just one person sitting here in your little cubbyhole reading Marx all the time. But and here's the Communist Party, big of China, they know what they're doing. I mean, is the faith the basis of determining Marx? Then Marx had no business of doing what he was doing. So Chinese Communist Party is shepherding capitalism. That's the point. And its outcome is the same ecological disaster for Chinese people as for the world, as it was American. If you ask about people approving, as Jean was saying, approving, 1960s, I couldn't hardly find anybody who opposed American capitalism. They'll say, Raj, you don't understand. You come from India. This is not capitalism. This is democracy. Okay? So the point is, what are the principles? What have we learned from Marx and Lenin? If we continue to justify what is not socialism and going towards communism, important thing about socialism, it has to move towards communism. It cannot stay there, otherwise it slides back. And that's the point Kambiz has made. How do you get to the unalienated society? And if you cannot go there in one step, you have to have movement towards it. So that's the point. That's my last point, and we can go into informal discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. That's a good point to end up on the formal discussion. It's a little after 12:30. The last half hour is sort of a free-for-all. I think we will unmute everybody or allow everybody to be unmuted. And people can jump in and make comments, much more informal.
And we are stopping the recording then.
Okay, very good. And Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Niebuhr Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.